Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This is the first episode of 2023, so I hope that you had a good holiday and a happy new year. I am back talking about weird haunted state parks in North Carolina. Last time I talked about William B. Umstead State Park in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I looked at some of the ways that the park's past have bubbled up into the present, like the remains of old gardens after people's homes have fallen apart or been removed, hidden cemeteries, and that sort of thing. This time I want to talk about Eno River State Park, which is a beautiful park in Durham, North Carolina, that has a lot of stories of hauntings and some cool hidden cemeteries. Before I get into this episode, just a quick note that I will be talking about settler colonialism and chattel slavery quite a lot in this episode. So if that's difficult for you to hear about, maybe skip this one. So let's get into Eno River State Park. Unlike Umstead State Park, I haven't spent as much time hiking in Eno River State Park. I've probably hiked there 4 or 5 times, and I have definitely not hiked every trail there. So it's definitely a park that I've spent a lot less time in. But it is a really cool park, and the only reason why I've spent less time there is because it's much further away from where my sister and her husband live in North Carolina. So I feel guilty about making them drive further to drop me off at the state park because I cannot drive. But if I had my druthers, I would have spent a lot more time at Eno River State Park. It is an awesome park. There are tons of ruins. And last time I talked about some more minor ruins that you might see off the trail in Umstead Park, like the foundations of buildings and part of an old dam. But Eno River State Park really has a lot of cool stuff. There's, in addition to the famously haunted cemetery, as well as some other cemeteries, there are the ruins of an old pump station, the ruins of a mill, old chimneys, and all sorts of things that are still large and standing. You know, I'm not talking about a foundation of a building. I'm talking about, in some cases, many walls of a building still there. So that's really cool. And then also in the summer, there are some beautiful places to see wildflowers. So if you are ever in Durham, it's very much worth a visit. The park is pretty large and it's near a city park. So combined, those two parks run along about 14 miles of the Eno River, which is a tributary of the Neuse River. The park is about 4,300 acres and it has 24 miles of hiking trails. Compared to Umstead State Park, I would say that Eno River State Park has a much creepier vibe, and it's just more famous for being haunted. And next time I'm going to talk about the little investigation that I did in Eno River State Park and some of the weirdness that I encountered there. Just a quick note in case you want to visit the park. One thing to keep in mind is that you want to know which area you are planning to hike in. Unlike Umstead, which just has 2 entrances, there are like 4 or 5 different areas, maybe more, that you could park in and go into a trail from. And some of them are pretty far away from each other. So if you're planning to go, look it up in advance and decide what trails you want to take before you decide where you want to park. And if you want to go to the more well-known haunted cemetery that I'm going to talk about later on, the Cabelands Cemetery, you're going to want to go to the Cabelands part of the park. So let's get into the history of this state park first. I will say this is a bit of an abbreviated history because I really am most interested in the history that relates potentially to the hauntings that people claim to have experienced in the park. And those stories seem to be centered around the Cabelands, the area where the Cabe family lived. So I will be focusing more on that particular family than I will on the other families and other people who lived around there. And I just wanted to explain why that is. And in addition to the Cabe family, I do want to talk about the other people who lived on their land and worked on their land. So I'll get into that as well. And of course, I'm interested in the people who lived there before them. So first, let's get into the indigenous history of the area. So the Eno River is named after the Eno people who lived on the banks of the river. And I guess I should preface this section with the fact that a lot of the information we have comes from the writing of European colonizers. So it may not all be entirely accurate, unfortunately, but it's the best information I was able to find. So based on archaeological evidence, indigenous people settled around the Eno River in the 1400s. So that lines up with the late medieval period in Europe, if you want that for reference. Since I rarely talk about history that's quite that far back, it felt worth giving a frame of reference there. It is unclear to me whether the people who settled there in the 1400s were the Eno people or an earlier group, because the specific sources that I consulted didn't specify. But there is confirmation from the historical record that as of the 1670s, the Eno and Shikori tribes lived in the area, and there was also an Okanichi village located there around the same time. I briefly mentioned the Okanichi last time, but I didn't get into their history at all. One European historian in 1705 said that the Okanichi language was treated like a lingua franca, or franca? I don't know Latin. So my pronunciation is always a bit off on these sorts of things, but basically it was kind of like how Latin functioned in Europe at the time. So basically it was a language that a lot of people knew, regardless of what their first language was. And people from different tribes could communicate with each other using this language. Researchers think that the Okanichi spoke a dialect of Tutelo, which is a Siouan language. And like with my Latin pronunciations not being good, I'm sorry for anything that I'm mispronouncing here. I'm doing my best, but I am not the world's best person when it comes to pronunciation. So anyway, overall, it doesn't sound like the Okanichi lived along the Eno River for very long. They were forced to move there from Virginia around 1676 when they were attacked by a militia of colonizers, and they left the Eno River Valley by 1712. But in the late 1600s, there was a common trade route called the Okanichi Path, or the Great Trading Path, which the Okanichi along the Eno River were located near. In the 1660s and 1670s, the Okanichi were involved in the fur and deerskin trade between European people in Virginia and indigenous people living in the Piedmont area of North Carolina. In the 1980s, archaeologists at UNC Chapel Hill excavated the old village and learned a little bit more about what it was like. There were about a dozen houses built in a circle around a central plaza. A sweat lodge stood in the middle of the village. A defensive stockade surrounded the houses, and a cemetery with a lot of graves in it lay just outside the village. The archaeologists observed that relative to the small size of the village and the short time that they lived there was a disproportionately large number of graves, which speaks to how many of the Okanichi were killed. European diseases and violence were responsible for many of those deaths, though they also experienced some conflict with the Iroquois. Today, the Okanichi Band of the Saponi Nation is a state-recognized tribe in North Carolina, and there are about 1,100 enrolled tribal members. So next we have the Eno, who were also Siouan-speaking, but there's not a ton of information about them as a group of people. This follows a fairly typical story of how the genocide in the land that is now the United States went. Colonizers came in, Native people were killed, and their land was taken. The accounts that I've read about the Eno people sort of hand-wave past what actually caused the decline in their population, though earlier on they did have some conflicts with Spanish colonizers, and there was a war in the 17 teens that they might have possibly been involved with, but it sounds like it really isn't known whether they were. But at any rate, the Eno ended up being absorbed into the Catawba tribe, who are still around today as the federally recognized Catawba Indian Nation, which is now headquartered in South Carolina and has 3,300 enrolled members. As for the Shikori, I found even less information about the Shikori, but it does look like they ended up merging with the Catawba as well, and they were also a Siouan-speaking people. So this brings us to the colonizers. After the Eno, Shikori, and Okanichi were forced out, colonizers lived along the river. Apparently, there were a lot of Quakers among the early colonizers who lived there in the 1740s and 1750s. The European colonizers set up farms and also a ton of grist mills there. One of the more famous people who lived along the Eno around this time was John Cabe. Like I said before, I'm going to really dwell on him here because the Cabe family is the main family that I want to talk about, in large part because their cemetery is known as being the famously haunted cemetery in the park. I've seen John Cabe described as a planter, miller, and politician. He was probably originally born in Pennsylvania, but he moved to the area around the Eno River in the late 1750s. His father was a well-off wagoner or teamster, someone who drives a wagon, but John Cabe ended up becoming very wealthy, which I'll talk about in a bit. In 1780, he bought more than 300 acres of land along the Eno River, but by the time he died in 1818, he had an estate of more than 3,000 acres of land. Somewhere else I saw 4,000, but let's just say somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 acres. It was a lot of land. He also enslaved 60 people, who I really haven't seen much about as I've been researching all of this. I tried to find information about the people who he enslaved in the existing records from this time, just because it doesn't sit right with me to have all this information about this enslavers on this plantation, but not the people who were enslaved. It feels like a really incomplete history of the land that we're talking about during the time period that we're concerned with here. So, the University of North Carolina has a database called the Digital Library on American Slavery, which is where I got most of this information. I will include a link to that in the show notes in case you want to access that resource. It is extremely helpful and very easy to use. So, here's what I was able to find out about the people who John Cabe enslaved. So, first, I found information about an enslaved man named Lewis who ran away from the Cabe family. It's unclear to me whether he was ever caught, though I hope not. Several ads were placed in local newspapers in February and then again in March of 1819, giving a reward for kidnapping him. In case you're curious, the first ad was a $10 reward, which is about $230 today, which I was really surprised by because that sounds really low to me. However, more on that later. And the second one just said that it would be a liberal award. I'm hoping that the need for multiple ads means that he escaped for good, but I don't really know. But here's what we do know about Lewis. He was knowledgeable and skilled in both farming and distilling. When he escaped, he was riding a fairly old bay mare, which is a type of horse. And after escaping, he probably passed as a freedman using the name Lewis Pettiford. So that was the most positive thing I was able to find in these records. After that, the rest of the things I found were deeds reflecting the purchase of people who John Cabe enslaved. And you can go on this resource and look at a scan of the actual deed in someone's cursive handwriting from back in the day. And it's truly chilling to read this transactional report of someone purchasing another human being. These documents are very dry and polite, and they really belie the great violence and evil that was being done here. So let's go through the 7 records I was able to find on UNC's website. So on January 1st of 1806, John Cabe purchased a 40-year-old woman named Tab, that's Tabb, from William Moreland, James Norton, and Polly Ashley for 5 shillings. For some reason, all of these purchases are in English money, like British money, British pounds and shillings. I don't know why. I had trouble finding an exact conversion for 5 shillings, but based on what I was able to find out, it sounds like 5 shillings in 1806 is about $20 today in 2023. So to just pause on that for a moment, this is the lowest amount in these records, though all of the amounts in these records are extremely low. So as you're listening to this, it's maybe worth thinking about what it means to value a human life so little. Like, obviously, enslavers did not value the people who they enslaved, but I was really surprised by these numbers because I just assumed that they would be much higher. I believe that Tab was sold to John Cabe by some of his in-laws because William Moreland was one of the prior enslavers, and in 1802, John Cabe married his second wife, Nancy Moreland Cabe. So I think that's why this amount here is so low, and I think that's what's going on in this particular record. So then the next day, on January 2nd, 1806, John Cabe purchased a 2-year-old boy named Tapley from Archibald D. Murphy for 30 British pounds, which is about $4,100 in today's US dollars. Tapley was Tab's son. I don't have any information about why Tapley and Tab were enslaved by different people. I'm not sure if they were related or not. Because these are just records of financial transactions, it doesn't give a ton of context. The following day, on January 3rd, 1806, John Cabe purchased a 9-year-old girl named Easter and a 7-year-old girl named Ginny, that's Jenney, from William Moreland for 152 British pounds total, which is $21,000 in today's US dollars. So very little money again. And William Moreland, like I mentioned, I believe was a relation of John Cabe. On the same day, he purchased a 37-year-old man named Dick, a 15-year-old girl named Rachel, a 5-year-old child named Charles, and those 3 people were purchased from James Norton for a combined 400 British pounds total, which is about 45,000 US dollars today. 2 years later, on January 23rd, 1808, John Cabe purchased a 9-year-old girl named Mary, who had been brought from Virginia to North Carolina, as well as a 7-year-old girl named Dilce, I think is how you say her name, it's Dilce, and a 9-year-old boy named Sam from Leonard Carleton for 200 British pounds total, which is about 27,000 US dollars today. And then later that year, on November 21st, 1808, John Cabe purchased a 40-year-old woman named Kate and a 13-year-old girl named either Dilly or Dilsey, it was a little bit hard to read the handwriting in the document, from Peter House for 75 British pounds, which is about 10,200 US dollars today. Like I said before, I'm assuming that these records are incomplete because I only found these 7 deeds and I read elsewhere that he had enslaved 60 people. But I was just struck, again, by how little money these people were sold for. And I think that that's worth dwelling on a little bit more because 1, it shows how little value enslavers put on the lives of the people they enslaved. And 2, it's worth seeing how much profit the plantation owners were getting by enslaving people rather than having paid employees. So I did a little bit of back of the envelope math, which should be taken with a grain of salt because I did this real quick while I was working on the script, just to have a general frame of reference to get my head around the ways in which people like John Cabe were exploiting the labor of the people who he enslaved. You know, this is setting aside like the evil that is chattel slavery, because it's, you know, obviously an act of profound violence to enslave another human being. But as we're thinking about this place, the Cabelands, which is occasionally described as a plantation in some stuff that I've read online, but which seems to often be described as more of like an estate, a farm, just lands. It feels a little bit like maybe some of this history is being whitewashed. And I think it's important to know who was living there with the Cabe family and where the Cabe family really got their money in order to have a better picture of this location. So here's the math that I did. I found an old document listing what agricultural workers were paid in Massachusetts in 1806 to use as a comparison. I chose Massachusetts because I needed to choose somewhere in the north where people were being paid to do labor rather than the south where people were not paid to do this sort of labor in general. You know, of course, people in the north were not being paid enough, but it was, something. The wages ranged from about 63 cents to $1.17 a day in 1806, but I was able to find a number from 1825 that included room and board. So basically, the room and board is subtracted from the pay, and so people are receiving a lower rate because of that. So it felt to me like that would be more accurate for the math that I'm trying to do here. So the room and board wage is a much lower $10 to $12 a month. So 12 months times $10 to $12 is $120 to $144 in $1825, which would be approximately $3,612 to $4,335 in today's money. So looking again at John Cabe's deeds, in today's US dollars, he paid between $20,000 and $15,000 for each person who he enslaved. So that means even on the high end, for the $15,000 he paid for Dick, who was 37, Rachel, who was only 15, and Charles, who was only 5, he could expect to force all 3 of them to do many years of work for what it would cost to pay an employee for just 3 to 4 years of work. So it's just worth keeping this in mind when thinking about the history of this area and this family, that anyone who's wealthy was not earning it. They were accumulating their wealth by doing truly evil things. And as you can see based on this math, it is very easy to accrue wealth when a huge amount of the costs of doing business are just gone because you have decided to enslave people instead of paying them for their labor and, respecting them as humans and allowing them to have free lives, etc. So biographies of John Cabe seem to kind of skim over his great wealth, again, as if it was something that he had earned, and no need to look too closely at it. For example, the Dictionary of North Carolina Biography says, John attained a real affluence before his death in 1818, when his estate included over 3,000 acres of land. It cites his mill on the Eno River, which was built sometime in the 1770s as the source of his prosperity, in addition to the second mill on the Eno that he built for his son-in-law. But again, how could anyone not accumulate a huge amount of money when they have enslaved people who they can just exploit? So anyway, that's what I was able to find about the many people who were enslaved by the Cabe family at the time that John Cabe was alive. To continue on to the story of the Cabe family, the details that are relevant here, Cabe went on to have 9 daughters, at least one of whom was buried at the family cemetery that John Cabe himself was buried in. I'll be looping back to that cemetery in a bit because it's the one with all of the stories of hauntings. But you might be wondering, whatever happened to the Cabe family and their enormous wealth? There's an article on ABC 11 that talks about how there was a train stop nearby called Durham Station, which in 1869 became its own town. The article quotes an expert who said, once Durham had the railroad, the Eno communities could not compete economically. By the 1960s, the Eno River Valley was a large wilderness, and that happened because the farmers and the millers in the area ended up moving to more urban areas. And the word is kind of just that the Cabe family, quote, faded into obscurity. While at one point there had been more than 30 mills along the Eno River, by 1940, all those mills had been shut down. So that's a quick thumbnail sketch of the history of the area, but in particular the people who lived on the Cabe's property. Let's talk about some of the cemeteries that are hidden in these woods. So, of course, there's the Cabelands Cemetery or the John Cabe Family Cemetery. This is the big haunted one that everyone talks about. The cemetery contains 51 graves, 12 of which are marked, and because Cabe has had daughters, a lot of the people buried there have different last names. You'll see a lot of Shields and McCones. If you walk around there, you'll see indentations in the ground, which apparently are places where rotting caskets have caused the ground to sink. There are also little circles of stone around where the body would have laid, kind of like in Umstead State Park at one of the cemeteries there that I was talking about. And like I mentioned last time, I haven't seen these weird stone circles on graves anywhere else, but they're definitely a thing in the Triangle, at least. So before we talk about some of the hauntings at the Cabelands Cemetery, there are a few other cemeteries in the state park. So there's the William Cabe Slave Cemetery. I'm pretty sure that William Cabe was John Cabe's brother. I'm not totally sure how to get to this cemetery, but it is apparently on the grounds of the park. I'll link to the Find a Grave page that has the exact coordinates, so you can look it up if you're curious. But as you might expect, we don't have a ton of information about this cemetery. There are about 20 graves that are visible based on depressions in the ground from the rotting caskets or fieldstone markers. None of the stones have any inscriptions. Some people buried there may have been enslaved by John and William Cabe's father, Barnaby Cabe. Oh, and if you're curious, apparently, according to findagrave.com, Barnaby Cabe was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, as was John Cabe. So, they were anti-revolution. Just interesting. There's also a William Cabe family cemetery near the slave cemetery, but it is located on private property. I'll include the Find a Grave listing for that one too, with the coordinates. There's a cemetery called the Dunnigan Graveyard, which is located along the Dunnigan Trail. It has 1 marked grave and 4 graves with field stones placed at the head and foot of the graves. There is also the Piper Family Cemetery, which is a small cemetery that is near a picnic area at the state park. I'll include the link with instructions on how to get to the cemetery, but it sounds like it's pretty easy to get to, though I have not been there. I also know that apparently the Piper family had a schoolhouse that used to stand near the current location of the picnic area, so I think that would have been near where the cemetery is. All right, those are the cemeteries. Now let's talk about the hauntings of the Cabelands Cemetery. So most of the stories seem to come from 2 people, Herb Englishman and Keith Campbell. There are multiple places that quote both of them, and I haven't seen, I don't think, a lot of quotes from other people. So I mention this not to cast aspersions about the veracity of any of these claims, but just to say that it seems like there's 2 very vocal people making a lot of these claims, but not a ton of other people talking about their own experiences in the cemetery. This isn't a situation like the Goatman's Bridge, which I talked about previously in a series that I did last year, where I went through hundreds of comments, like YouTube comments, reviews on, Yelp and Google reviews from ordinary people who had a variety of different experiences at the bridge. This seems to be a more quiet haunting in that paranormal investigators are interested in it. I do think that there is something weird about that spot, and I definitely believe that it is haunted, but it doesn't seem like something that has permeated the surrounding area in terms of being a popular urban legend or anything like that, which again doesn't mean that these claims are not true, but it was just interesting to contrast it with something like the Goatman's Bridge. All right, so anyway, I wanted to read a little bit of a account written by Herb Englishman that was published on enoriver.org. It's interesting, enoriver.org is a source that I've been using for years for information about Eno River State Park. And interestingly, a lot of the pages that I used to use as a source have since been taken down. It looks like they did a redesign of their website. So I'll include a link to the Wayback Machine version of this story in case you want to read it yourself or look at more info. So, to quote from Herb Englishman, "In the Cabelands, stories abound about the family and how their spirits remain alive today. There is a long-abandoned family cemetery about 200 yards off the trail by the Eno River. Although interesting, there is no aura to it. Graves are where the body returns to the earth and places for the living to visit the deceased. Spirits tend to hang out at places that hold the most significance to them. The special spot for feeling the energies of the historical site is the homestead area at the edge of the bluff overlooking the Eno River. A massive oak tree lays just before the bluff. There is a distinct warm, happy vibe to the land. I have visited the home site area numerous times and gotten EVP recordings every time. a man, a woman, and a girl. The girl seems to be the most talkative. She appears as if she was standing right next to you. On another occasion, a man's voice was heard, and you could make out the words, noise of about, miller, flags, and years. There's also an article on WRAL that has a lot of great details. It talks about how hikers have claimed to hear whispers and screams and have seen shadow people. And the article does quote Englishmen some. So the article talks about how the land around the Cabelands has a lot of young trees, which means that it was flat land that was suitable for farming. But there is an old oak tree on a bluff at the site where the homestead had been. So to read a bit from the article, centuries ago, this quiet bluff would have been where the Cabe family lived, overlooking the peaceful Eno River and farming their acres of land. It's likely they once played and sat beneath the old oak standing there today. So that's the area where Herb Englishman had talked about how he got EVP recordings there every time he visited. One thing that I realized while I was rereading this, while I was recording it, I realized that this WRAL article didn't interview Herb Englishman directly. It just quotes from the passage that I just read out loud from enoriver.org. So again, when it comes to this story, it's almost like a couple accounts of this haunting are little stones that were thrown into a pond, and there's all these ripples coming out from them, all these different stories about the haunting, but they're all kind of coming from the same source or the same event. So in terms of volume, it doesn't seem like there's a high volume of people experiencing things there. Though while I was recording this, I was thinking about it, and I'm going to dig even deeper to see if I can find anything else about the site. I think there might be some people on YouTube who did investigations there that just didn't pop up when I was doing my initial searches for this. So I just want to find what other experiences people may have had, because they're pretty limited in the big sources that you find when you search this. There is a little bit more in this WRAL article that has a few more stories, so I'll read those as well. Following the haunted legends, many local ghost seekers have investigated these lands. One man described seeing a shadow person standing on the trail just as he was trying to leave the cemetery. The shadow person appeared to be male. He just stood there, only a few feet away from me, but before I could get my camera, he was gone, said paranormal investigator Keith Campbell. Many people have claimed to hear a young woman's friendly voice greeting them. Others report shrieks from the woods. Some hikers say that they sense someone standing beside them, even whispering or blowing into their ear. They turn, thinking a fellow hiker is beside them, only to discover that they are alone on the trail. A 2018 article on ABC 11 also quotes Keith Campbell of Wake Paranormal TV, who has gone to the cemetery to do investigations, and the quote from this article is, "I had literally just walked into the cemetery when I saw a shadow figure only 10 feet ahead of me. I didn't even have my gear out yet." So the same story, but a slightly different quote, because in one article it says he had just been leaving the cemetery, and this one says he had just been walking into the cemetery, but about the same. To keep reading through the article, testing the validity of the cemetery's cultural mythos, he did his own EVP recordings near the cemetery, mostly picking up radio signals and talk shows, nothing more than the occasional pop song. Suddenly, a woman's voice wavered through the static. "Hello?" The voice vanished into the static. A few minutes later, Campbell heard her again, garbled this time, but clearly the same voice. Several times throughout the hike, the woman's voice would abruptly break through the white noise, but her words were always garbled after that first hello. Campbell's tale just adds another chilling chapter to the Cabelands legends. I will say, I think there's a typo in this article, because it says that he was doing EVP recordings, but the article seems to be describing him using a spirit box. I've talked about spirit boxes before and about how they should be taken with a grain of salt, because it's just scanning quickly through radio stations and it's easy to hear what you want to hear. I am not trying to disprove this claim, since I wasn't there and I don't know what happened, but it just felt worth mentioning that since the article seems like it was a little bit off in describing what he was doing. Then there's a 2019 ABC 11 article that quotes the superintendent of Eno River State Park, Kimberly Radowitz. So to read from this article, rumors are the only claims to support this former farmland is haunted. Reports of shadows moving over the trails, words spoken by a woman. Then a quote from Radowitz. Things that I have heard is that it is a warm sort of place, not a lot of fear here or anything like that. Previous superintendents of the park say they haven't had any personal encounters, only the rumors. So a couple things here. So first, the idea of there being a warm feeling sounds a lot like Herb Englishman's description of the area as having a distinct warm, happy vibe. So my guess would be that Radowitz has heard about the warm vibe from Herb Englishman or his writing. And also the article claims that rumors are the only things that suggests that the area is haunted. And I just want to push back on that because yes, there are some rumors, vague claims like the ones that describe hikers feeling someone's breath in their ear or someone whispering in their ear definitely qualify as rumors because they're not tied to any particular person who's reporting the story. But there are at least 2 named people who have described their experiences in the park, and I just don't think it's accurate to say that their personal experiences amount to rumors. So I know this is a semantic issue that I have with this article, but it just seemed a little unfair to me, so I wanted to talk about that. And then also, it's worth mentioning that this article dances around Cabe's involvement in the Revolutionary War, saying that he, quote, of course was part of the Revolutionary War, without saying which side he fought for. I bring this up just because findagrave.com said that he and his father were both loyalists, but other sources seem to equivocate on that. I'm not trying to do a hit piece against John Cabe here. I'm just reporting the things I've been reading online, but it felt worth mentioning that there's a little bit of vagueness when people who seem to be trying to paint a rosy picture of John Cabe talk about his involvement in the Revolutionary War, which might be a similar sort of whitewashing to the articles that talk about Cabe's business success, but don't talk about how he enslaved people in order to reach that success. So anyway, on that note, that's what I wanted to talk about this time. Like I said, I'm gonna see what other stories I can dig up about the Cabelands Cemetery for next time. I feel like there's gotta be at least a few other things, though these are the big ones. And of course, next time I'm gonna talk about the trip to North Carolina that I went on in October/November 2021, which was just a really strange time overall. And it did include visits to Umstead State Park and Eno River State Park. And I did do a bit of solo paranormal investigation while I was there. And there was some interesting stuff that came out of that experience that I wanted to talk about. And it's going to be an episode sort of along the lines of my first Scranton episode, where I talk about paranormal experiences, but really try to root it in the context of what was happening in my life at the time, in terms of how the trip was going, etc. Because there's definitely some weirdness there. But in the meantime, if you want to check out the show notes with all of my sources, you can visit BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can also sign up for my newsletter. I'm kind of using it to explore stuff that doesn't quite make sense to have its own episode, and that might be more focused on weirdness, even if it's not directly tied to the paranormal. I already sent out one issue, which you can read even if you weren't signed up at the time that I sent it, that was about liminality and vampires. And, you know, I have ADHD, so I have like parts of like 5 different next issues written. I'm not 100% sure which one I'm going to end up sending out first, but I've been thinking a lot about liminality and the concept of junk space and nostalgia and kind of like the state of the world right now and how liminal everything feels. So maybe I'll send that one out soon, but it's definitely going to be a place where you can get definitely more of my thoughts that I am still forming, and also more queer stuff. So if that interests you, sign up for the newsletter. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. If you liked this episode, please rate and review it on your podcatcher of choice. Please tell your friends about it. That really helps get the word out. And thanks so much for listening.